Historical accounts show that English came to West Africa sometime in the 15th century. These earliest contacts led to the emergence of some broken language, which served as a lingua franca between European traders and coastal population in Western Africa. Cape of Good Hope was the first and for a long time the only permanent European settlement in Africa. However, from 1870 onwards, imperial aggression, military invasion, diplomatic pressure, and eventually conquest and colonization took place in Africa. So much so that by 1914, the West African continent was divided into several territories. After the two world wars, a repartitioning of these territories took place. Many of these territories declared independence around 1960s. Around the same time, Organization of African Unity was also formed to ensure that there was no further redefining of African territories. Gradually, with increase in commerce and anti-slave activities, English further spread in Africa. A campaign had been going on in England against slavery since the 18th century, 1760s to be exact. There were people, both black and white, who were taking part in this campaign. Pro-slavery people argued that slavery was good for British economy. They also claimed that the slaves were treated very well. However, there was a lot of evidence to the contrary. The appalling conditions in which these slaves were kept, had become known to the entire world. There were also frequent rebellions by these slaves in the West Indies particularly. In 1807, the British Parliament passed an act for the abolition of slave trade. According to this act, slave trade was completely banned between Europe, America, and West Indies. A further act was passed in 1833, which abolished slavery in Canada, Cape of Good Hope, and West Indies, which meant that it was illegal to own a person as a slave. Thousands of ships were seized, and Royal Navy's West Indies Squadron seized thousands of ships and also freed an equal number of slaves. These freed slaves now needed a homeland and a settlement. Thus, several settlements were made for these slaves in West African countries. These settlements also served as bases for the operations of Royal Navy, who conducted their operations or carried out their activities at sea using these countries as their base. Later, these settlements also came under colonial rule and became crown colonies. These settlements where slaves were kept were also visited by missionaries who believed that slavery was an unchristian practice, and they also tried to preach Christianity to these recently freed slaves. The countries which show a preference for the British variety of English include these 5 countries, which are all located in West Africa. These countries fall in a highly multilingual region. Some have as many as 500 regional languages. Alongside these regional languages, there were several varieties of English, native varieties of English, which were being used in Africa by colonial officials and missionaries. When so many regional languages were being used by native English varieties, the creation or emergence of creoles and pidgins was inevitable. So, several pidgins and creoles emerged from this region. An English-based creole called Creole is a major form of communication in these countries. In East Africa, English began to spread after the formation of British East African Company in 1888. After the formation of British East African Company, several of the countries in East Africa were declared British protectorates. A protectorate is not a colony, but it is under the control of a sovereign country. A colony is controlled directly by the country which claims control over the region, whereas a protectorate is indirectly controlled by the sovereign country. So, in this case, our colony was controlled by the colonial office in London directly, whereas a protectorate was controlled by the British authorities through a local ruler. So, we can look at a protectorate as an autonomous part of a sovereign country. So many of these East African countries were declared British protectorates. Almost all the protectorates after liberation declared English as their official language. This gives us an idea of the influence that English had exercised over these people. This region also had a large number of immigrants, settlers who had come from England to live in this area. Therefore, there was a large number of African-born whites present in this area who used native varieties of English as their first language. A British model was also introduced in schools. Therefore, there was a range of mother tongue English varieties present in this region. This chart gives us an idea of the popularity or the use of English or the spread of English in Africa. If you notice, almost all these countries have English as their official language. So in these countries, English is either a sole official language or an associate official language. And if you look at the number of users who use English as either L1 or L2, the number is in millions, which means that they make a significant contribution to the total number of English speakers around the world.